Exactly right. Thanks. That's very important. You see, the banks for cooperatives are part of the nationwide farm credit system. In every one of the nation's 12 farm credit districts, there is a land bank that makes long-term loans through localized land bank associations. And there's an intermediate credit bank that makes shorter-term loans through localized production credit associations. And in each district, there is also a bank for cooperatives. Each bank for cooperatives serves the farm co-ops in its own area. That way, each bank is thoroughly familiar with the farm business problems common to its own area. For farmers, problems vary a lot from region to region of the country. So each bank has the advantage of knowing when a co-op has a problem, how other co-ops in the same area have solved the same problem. On top of that, the banks work together with each other, with the other banks of the farm credit system, and with all other farm institutions. The banks swap information and experience all around so as to keep up to date on problems all over the country. What it all boils down to is simply this. The banks provide for, say, one little co-op in the middle of nowhere, a kind of national network of information and guidance. And one of the important things that means is that even though money might be temporarily what they call tight in one area, the bank in that area doesn't have to be tight with its loans.
Chuck, what exactly do co-ops borrow money for?
Oh, you guys must be reading my mind. My notes. I'm just coming to that, honest.
That's the mark of good organization, Chuck. Anticipating your audience's questions as they naturally arise.
Thank you, sir. Okay, about what co-ops borrow for. Well, first let me say that the size of the loans varies all over the lot. Some are for thousands, and some are for millions, and every amount in between. Some of the purposes of the loans you'd hardly ever think of. Minks, for instance. There's a farm co-op that makes high-quality feed for these little rascals, so they'll make prettier fur coats. And there are mushroom co-ops. Oh, we sure eat a lot of mushrooms in this country. And believe it or not, processing radish seed by the carload is another big co-op business. Even though the seeds are so tiny, a couple of thousand will barely fill a thimble. You know, a man at one of the banks wrote me that you really can't tell what a bank for co-ops will make a loan for until you apply for it. Anyway, what you might call normal loan purposes divide themselves into three main categories. And they make it possible for the banks to render co-ops a complete loan service. Actually, I got the impression that the banks will at least consider any loan application they get from a co-op. Now, to give you a further idea of how busy the banks are kept, I'm going to show you a figure to keep in mind. Between them, the banks for cooperatives are now lending money at the rate of more than $1 billion a year. And the amount is increasing every year as our population grows and eats more food. And the thing a whole lot of people don't know is that the money the banks lend, they get by selling securities to private investors. But you know, when you come right down to it, the amount of money the banks lend is not the real measure of the help they give farmers through their co-ops. The work the banks themselves consider most important is summed up by the word service. It takes many forms. The bank's personnel spends a lot of time consulting with co-ops management people on practically any co-op problem that arises. The co-op bank people also give a lot of technical assistance as they get requests from the co-ops. One of the fields the banks help co-ops in is called financial planning, setting up budgets and cash projections, things like that. And of course, the banks help co-ops a great deal with the training of co-op personnel. They told me a lot of this training goes on almost all the time. You know, There are more farm co-ops in this country than you might think. About 9,000. Selling, buying, and farm business service cooperatives. And that doesn't include the farm credit cooperatives, like the production credit associations and the land bank associations, nor the rural electric and telephone co-ops, nor the farmers' mutual insurance companies. Every year, farmers do a bigger share of their business through their own co-ops. Why, the gross business done by co-ops is almost out of sight. Selling co-ops do a total of $14 billion worth of business every year. Buying co-ops, a total of $4 billion. And that makes a grand total of $18 billion every single year.
That's a lot of money.
Sure. But there's another thing, too, in this money picture. Besides getting their members good prices for what they sell and good buys on what they purchase, farm co-ops pay dividends to their members. Patronage refunds are called. More than $1/2 billion a year.
Well, Chuck, why is it then that all farmers don't belong to co-ops?
Well, Dad says it's kind of the same reason everybody doesn't drive the same kind of car. Some farmers think that in the long run they can do better by going it alone than by working together with other farmers through co-ops.
Can they?
Well, gee, I honestly don't know for sure. But Dad says the co-op way is better, and he's tried it both ways.
Chuck,
Yes, sir?
aren't there any figures on that?
Not exactly, Mr. Thompson. No figures anyone's sure of. But the banks themselves say that, on the average, farmers now get better returns from their patronage and investment in their co-ops than they do from their investments in their farms, and they've got the figures to prove that.
Did I hear you right? Farmers do better on their patronage and investment in their co-ops than on investment in their farms?
Yes, sir. On the average, that's right. Farm economists say that on the average, farms return between 3 and 4% on the investment, and co-ops return between 6 and 7%. And that's almost twice as much. Many co-ops do better.
That's amazing. Oh, Chuck, another thing. You said banks for cooperatives don't lend government money. What do...
That's right, sir. The banks for co-ops lend private money. Every other month, as they need more money to lend, the banks for cooperatives jointly offer their debentures for sale to...
Debentures? What are debentures?
Thought somebody'd ask that. A debenture is kind of like a bond. Here. Pass those around. A debenture is a promise to pay. Actually, a promise to pay back to the buyer on a certain day the money he paid for it, plus the interest it's earned.
Who'd buy these things?
Well, you'd be surprised, Jack. You really would. Well, here, let me show you. Many more. The banks for cooperatives' debentures are considered such sound investments because they're backed by the whole nationwide farm co-op business that the investing public almost always wants to lend the banks even more money than they need. As a matter of fact, the banks provide co-ops about 60% of all the money cooperatives borrow, and at interest rates no higher than other businesses pay. This makes it possible for the banks always to help farmers' co-ops when times are good, most importantly, when times are bad. With money, of course, a complete credit service, and at the same time with the expert and understanding advice and guidance that gives the money extra value. Thank you.
Oh, Chuck, that was wonderful.
Chuck?
Yes, sir?
Chuck, congratulations. A fine piece of work. A very fine piece of work. It certainly rates an A. On second thought, it rates an A+, even as infrequently as I give them.
Well, as infrequently as I get them.
As a matter of fact, Chuck, I'm going to recommend it to your father's group. who you said are thinking of expanding the services of their co-op. I'm going to recommend that they hear and see your report in full. Would you give it to them?
Would I give it to him? Well, sure. Sure, Mr. Thompson. Gosh.